I grew up in Michigan's upper region, in a little logging town that hadn't changed since the early 60s. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and silence isn't rare. It's the rule. You hear your own breath more than voices. My dad was a quiet man, a Vietnam vet, not big on talking, but when he spoke, you listened. He taught me how to fish before I was even tall enough to see over the side of a boat. We'd go out every weekend, rain or shine, no motor, just oars and stillness. And rules, always the same ones. Never cast if the water's silent. Always watch the tree lines, and don't ever fish dead water. He said the name the way that people say cancer, like just mentioning it gave it power. I remember asking why once. He didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, because some lakes take more than they give. I was 12 when he said that. I never asked again. Fast forward 20 years. I'm 32, back home after a divorce that shattered everything. I lost the house, the dog, and most of my pride. My mom passed 2 winters ago, and Dad had died of a stroke last spring, sitting in that same rowboat, still holding a rod when they found him. That image haunted me, him frozen, eyes wide open, like he saw something before he went. I moved into the old cabin temporarily. It was late September, and the air had that wet, dying leaf smell that always hit me hard. I spent my days chopping wood, fixing leaks, and taking long drives. Anything to keep my mind from drifting back to her, or to Dad. Then one day I saw the sign. Half buried in moss, a weathered wooden plank nailed to a pine tree off the side of the logging road. Dead water, no trespassing. The paint was nearly gone, but the word hit me like a punch. I pulled over and stared at it for a long time. It had been 20 years. I wasn't a scared kid anymore. I had a rod in the back of the truck, a thermos of hot coffee, and an ache in my chest that only silence could fix. So I ignored the rule. The trail was still there, barely. It hadn't been maintained since Dad's day, just a thin game path winding through undergrowth and deadfall. I hiked half a mile through clawing branches and thick moss before the trees opened into a clearing. There it was, dead water. The lake was small, no more than 50 yards across, but it looked infinite. The surface was pitch black and glass still, like a pool of oil. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind in the trees. Just dead silence. It felt like I was standing at the edge of a photograph, flat, frozen, too perfect. There was an old dock half sunken, bleached gray from decades of rot. I stepped onto it and felt it groan under my weight, but hold. I cracked open my thermos, poured a cup, and cast a silver spoon into the water. Nothing. No ripples, no motion. My lure vanished without a sound. Minutes dragged by. My thoughts wandered. Divorce, Dad, how empty the world felt. The kind of thoughts you only have when no one's around to hear them. Then the line jerked. Not a nibble, a full body pull, hard and steady. I stood, heart racing, and started to reel. Whatever was on the line was heavy, but it wasn't fighting like a fish. There were no surges or thrashes. It just pulled slowly, rhythmically, like it was working its way toward me. And then it broke the surface. A thick, glistening tentacle, dark gray with veins of sickly green. It coiled and twisted, suction cups lying down its length, some of them opening and closing like mouths. It wasn't flailing. It wasn't scared. It was climbing the line. I froze. I don't know why I didn't drop the rod. Maybe my brain refused to believe it. Maybe I was waiting for the dream to break, but it kept coming. When the tentacle reached the dock, it slapped down with a sickening wet thud, leaving behind globs of mucus that hissed and bubbled on the wood. I could smell it now, like salt water and rotting fish mixed with copper and sulfur, a smell that didn't belong in the woods. I finally snapped out of it, dropped the rod, backed off the dock, and ran. Branches tore at my jacket. I tripped once, slammed my knee into a root, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't even breathe until I burst through the tree line and back into my truck. I didn't sleep that night, locked every door, sat in the cabin with a fire going and my old hunting rifle across my lap. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. Water. Not rain, not a leak. Dripping, slow and deliberate, inside the walls. I stood, heart in my throat, and walked to the front door. The air smelled wrong, like lake rod and rust. I opened the door just an inch and saw wet prints leading up to the porch. Sucker marks, perfect circles in the mud, and then, on the wooden steps, the trail ended at the door. The next morning, I drove straight to town, bought a new padlock, a new phone, and supplies, but I didn't go back to Deadwater. I told myself I imagined it, that stress, grief, and whiskey had made a monster out of tree roots and shadows. But 3 nights later, someone or something left my snap fishing rod propped up against the cabin, still wet, completely covered in the sucker marks. I moved out to Stillwater Lake 2 years ago, after the kind of personal collapse that leaves you with only 2 real options: crawl deeper into the chaos or run until you can't hear the pieces crashing anymore. I ran. Left Detroit with a storage unit full of junk, a hunchback from 20 years of pouring concrete, and my cat, Milo, crated in the passenger seat. I was never a cat guy before Milo. He just showed up one winter, half frozen on my apartment's fire escape. I let him in and he never left. He was quiet and observant, had this way of watching you like he already knew what you were going to do. The lake house belonged to my uncle before he died, one of those isolated cabins they built cheap in the 60s. Screen porch, wood stove, tin roof that sings in the rain. No neighbors for at least a mile in any direction. The kind of place where the world feels paused. Stillwater Lake sat right out front, like a black mirror framed by pine trees. I thought I'd rebuild myself out there, heal, and for a while, I did. I chopped wood, read old paperbacks, spent long, silent hours on the dock with a rod in one hand and Milo curled beside me like a warm, purring rock. We had a rhythm: coffee in the morning, fishing in the afternoon, whiskey and firelight at night. Milo would sleep in the armchair, snoring softly, while the wind creaked through the trees. We were okay. Then came the day he vanished. It was a Wednesday, crisp September morning. Fog clung to the water like gauze. I was trying a new lure onto my line when I noticed Milo wasn't on the dock. I didn't panic. He wandered sometimes, usually down the shore or into the woods to chase squirrels, but he'd always come back. By dinner, I was calling his name. By midnight, I was in the woods with a flashlight, clanging a can of food like a dummy, whispering, "Come on, buddy, where are you?" Nothing. No paw prints, no fur, no sound. I sat on the porch till sunrise, convinced I'd hear his claws on the steps, but I didn't. Day 2 passed, then 3, and on the 4th night, just past 1 a.m., I woke to the sound of scratching on the porch screen. I bolted up, heart racing, grabbed the flashlight, praying, hoping, not daring to believe. And there he was, Milo, soaked, muddy, his fur matted in clumps. His ears were pinned back, his eyes wide, pupils blown out, like he'd seen something far too long. He didn't meow, didn't move. I opened the door and crouched. "Milo?" He stepped forward, slow, too slow, and that's when I felt it. Something was wrong. Not just the dirt or the silence, not just his smell, which was sharp and metallic, like a battery left out in the rain. It was how he moved, like something learning how to walk like a cat. The cadence was off. Each paw landed too precisely, as if he was testing the ground for the first time. I should have shut the door, but I didn't. I let him in. He walked straight to his old chair, curled up and closed his eyes. But he didn't sleep. He just watched the fire for hours, not blinking, breathing slow, like one breath every 30 seconds. I sat across from him, pretending to read, glancing over every minute or so. His ears didn't twitch at sound. His tail didn't flick. He was so still. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe he'd fallen into the lake or gotten lost and was in shock. Animals are resilient, I reminded myself. But deep down, I knew something had changed. The next days confirmed it. He wouldn't eat when I was in the room. He stopped purring except at night when the lights were off. Then I'd hear it, faint and wet, like air bubbling through a drain. Not from his throat, from deep inside him. He no longer meowed, Not even when I stepped on his tail by accident, and he watched me constantly. Not with affection or trust, but with interest, like a scientist watching a rat in a maze. It was weeks later when I went down to the dock again. I hadn't fished since the day he disappeared. I needed distraction, something normal, something grounding. I brought my rod, a thermos of coffee, and sat in my usual spot. Milo followed, or the thing that looked like Milo did. He didn't sit beside me like before. He stayed at the edge of the trees, tail perfectly still, eyes locked on me. I cast my line, nothing for 20 minutes. Then a pull, slow and deep. I reeled in. Whatever was on the other end was heavy, not strong but deliberate. It didn't fight. It just resisted, like it knew it wasn't supposed to come up yet. Then the surface broke. It wasn't a fish. It was a piece of something, grayish, slick, a tentacle or a root maybe, covered in tiny pulsating orifices that looked disturbingly like cat mouths, rows of teeth, pink tongues, and then it let go. The line snapped back, spraying water into my face. When I wiped my eyes, Milo was sitting on the dock behind me. I never heard him move, he was just there, and he was purring that low, wet purr. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time. I pushed a dresser in front of it, sat up with the rifle my dad left me. Milo paced the hallway at night. I could hear his claws ticking on the wood. At 3:17 a.m., the doorknob turned. Not rattled, turned, deliberate and slow. I didn't sleep. The next day I packed. I loaded Milo into his old crate. He didn't resist, didn't meow, just stared at me with that too wide gaze, unblinking. I drove 3 hours to a vet in the next town. Told him he might have eaten something in the woods. I watched from behind the glass as they examined him. The vet came out pale. "There's something in his stomach," she said. "Moving. We need to sedate him." I nodded, waited in the lobby, hands shaking. 15 minutes later, the lights in the back flickered. Then the screaming started. By the time I got back there, 2 techs were on the floor, unconscious. The vet was gone, just gone, and the crate was open. So was the back door. It's been 6 months. I left Stillwater, moved in with my sister in Ohio. I don't fish anymore, don't go near lakes. I can't. But sometimes I wake up to scratching on her back door. And once, just once, I saw 2 yellow eyes staring at me from the woods behind the house. They blinked, sideways, not up and down. And deep beneath the floorboards, when the house is quiet, I swear I hear purring, but not the kind that comforts, the kind that waits. I've always thought there's a unique kind of silence that exists only near water. Not the kind of quiet you get in a room or a library, but that heavy, breath-holding silence that settles in when you're standing alone at the edge of a lake, and the only thing you can hear is your heartbeat. That's the kind of silence I remember the most about the weekend Travis disappeared. We'd been fishing together since we were 16, 2 dumb kids skipping school, borrowing his dad's rusted John boat, and getting sunburned catching bluegill we were too soft to clean. Though all the ups and downs of life, breakups, layoffs, moves, we always made time for a yearly fishing trip. It was tradition, a chance to get away from the noise of the world. That year, Travis picked the spot. He'd found it online, some old anglers forum, said the place was called Lake Kizal. I never heard of it, and I know my Michigan lakes like the back of my hand. That's the point, he said over the phone. Off-grid, remote, supposed to have monster bass and no crowds. No amenities either, I bet. Come on, we slept in worse. He wasn't wrong. So we packed up our gear, tossed a cooler in the back of his Tacoma, and made the 6-hour drive north into dense, nowhere wilderness. The paved roads turned to gravel, the gravel turned to dirt, then the GPS gave up completely. By the time we found the lake, the sun was low and orange behind a line of black pines. The air smelled like wet moss and cold metal. No houses, no boats, not even tire tracks. The lake was small, circular, and perfectly calm. The kind of calm that makes you pause. Not even a ripple, just black gas. There was a dock, rotted but sturdy looking, jutting out into the still water. A crooked, hand-painted sign nailed to a birch tree nearby read, "No camping. Private. Stay away." Travis laughed when he saw it. "Think we should leave?" "Nope," he grinned. "Think we found the good stuff." We set up camp just inside the tree line, pitched 2 tents, built a small fire, roasted hot dogs, and told the same stories we'd been telling for 15 years. By midnight, we were both buzzed and relaxed, the lake of a sheet black ink beyond the flames. "I'm going to get one last cast in," Travis said, standing up and grabbing his rod. "Seriously? Best time to catch something big. Always is." He walked toward the dock, whistling. I stayed by the fire, watching the embers and sipping a beer. I could hear the soft plop of his lure hitting the water. Then silence. 5 minutes, 10, 15. "Travis?" I called, not loudly at first. I got no answer. Walked to the dock and his rod was propped up on the wood, the line still taut, bobber gently bouncing, but he was gone. I didn't panic at first. Figured maybe he'd wandered into the trees to take a leak. Maybe he caught something and was dealing with it off of the side of the dock. But as the minutes stretched on and the night grew colder, that tight feeling began to knot in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight and circled the campsite, called his name, checked both tents, walked the tree line. There's nothing, just woods and water, and that silence pressing in from all sides. I went back to the dock. His rod was still there, the line now slack. No sign of a struggle, no torn clothing, no wet footprints on the dock, nothing. I stayed up all night, walking back and forth from the fire to the lake, calling his name until my voice was gone. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard something, fire out on the water, a splash, a voice. "Matt." My name. It was so faint I almost convinced myself I imagined it, but I didn't. I waited until dawn and drove until I had service. Called the sheriff's office. They sent a search team out with dogs and a boat, but they found nothing, not even a boot. I gave my statement. They asked the usual questions. Did he drink a lot? Was he upset? Did he know how to swim? Yes, no, yes. They labeled it an accidental drowning. Lake's deep, they said. Could have gotten snagged on something. Body might not surface for a while. But I knew better. Travis wasn't clumsy. He was careful. And he was smart. If he'd fallen in, there would have been a splash, a yell, something. But there was nothing. Just that empty rod on the dock and the lake staring back at me. I didn't go back for weeks, but the guilt ate at me. So I returned one foggy morning alone. The lake looked identical, still dead quiet. My boot prints were still faintly visible in the dirt. I stood at the edge of the dock for a long time. Didn't cast a line, didn't move. That's when I saw it. A watch, resting in the center of the dock. Travis's watch, still ticking, still warm. I picked it up and felt something deep in my chest shift, like a floorboard creaking in a room you thought was empty. Then I heard it, a splash far out in the lake. I turned and raised the flashlight. Something was floating, a shape, human maybe, just a head above water, drifting slowly, directly toward me. I called out but got no response as it got closer, and I realized it wasn't swimming. It wasn't paddling, it was just gliding, like it was being pulled from below. I stepped back and that's when it sank, smoothly, soundlessly, like it never wanted to be seen too clearly. The lake went still again. I dropped the watch and ran. That was 7 months ago. Since then, every year on the anniversary, a package shows up at my apartment door. No return address. And inside, a single lure, handmade, identical to the ones Travis used. Hook still sharp, paint still fresh and wet sometimes. Once I found a note inside. Just 5 words scribbled in smudged graphite. Cast once. Come join me. I haven't gone back, but sometimes I hear it. At night when I can't sleep. A splash, a whisper, a reel being cranked. And I know Travis is still out there, somewhere beneath that black water, waiting for one last cast. I used to think the worst thing about fishing alone was the boredom, the stillness, the waiting. I don't think that anymore. Now I know there are things worse than silence, like the feeling of being watched out in the middle of a lake with no land in sight, or hearing the boat creak beneath you in a way that doesn't make sense. But let me start from the beginning. It was mid-October when my cousin Nate invited me up to his grandfather's old cabin. The place was way up north, near the edge of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, past the paved roads and into that part of the state that's just trees, mist, and water. Nate and I were close growing up, real close. We hadn't seen much of each other since I moved south for work. We stayed in touch, sure, the occasional call or holiday text, but we hadn't spent a weekend together in almost 10 years. So when he called and said, "Hey, let's go up to Birch Hollow Lake and fish like we used to," I didn't hesitate. I packed a duffel bag, loaded my rods into the bed of my truck, and drove north through winding roads and red gold forests. By the time I arrived, the sun was already starting to drop behind the trees. The cabin stood at the edge of the lake, surrounded by pines, the paint flaking from its siding like dead skin. The lake itself was strange, even from the driveway. I could tell something was off about it. Perfectly round, perfectly still, no reeds or cattails along the shoreline, just open water, dark as oil, and flat enough to reflect the sky with mirror clarity. I couldn't see the far bank. There were no docks, no other cabins, no loons, no frogs, no bugs, not even the occasional buzz of mosquitoes, which for October in Michigan was unheard of. I told myself it was the cold snap that drove them off. That was easier than admitting the place felt wrong. That first night, Nate and I sat by the fire inside the cabin, telling old stories, drinking cheap beer, and eating jerky from a gas station that probably should have been condemned. He seemed relaxed, happier than I remembered him. "You ever fished this lake before?" he asked, tossing a beer cap into the crash. "A couple times with my granddad," he said. "Never caught much, but man, the water's weird here. Like sometimes it sounds like something's moving under there. Huge and slow, like it's turning over." I laughed half-hearted. "So it's haunted." "Maybe," he grinned. "Or maybe it's just a bottomless pit of mutant sturgeon. Either way, I brought the boat. We're fishing tomorrow morning." The next day, we hauled the old aluminum boat from the side shed, mounted the tiny outboard motor, and loaded up our gear. It was just after sunrise, cold enough that my breath came out in little clouds, but calm, no wind. The lake looked exactly like it had the night before, flat, black, and silent. As we drifted out into the center, I kept glancing over the sides. No bait fish, no movement, no insects touching the water. It was like the entire lake was asleep. But Nate was grinning ear to ear. He cast his line and said, "Give it a few. The big ones like deep water." We fished for a solid 2 hours, with nothing, not even a nibble. It didn't make sense. No panfish, no weeds, no sign of life at all. And then around 9 a.m., we heard it. A hollow thud. Not the boat, but under it. I looked at Nate. He looked at me. "What was that?" Before I could answer, the boat tilted. Just a bit, barely noticeable. Then it tilted again. A slow, deliberate lift, like we were riding a rising platform. The hull groaned. My stomach flipped. "Did we hit a log?" Or Nate started to say. And then the boat lurched upward. Not rocked by a wave, not shifted by wind, but lifted from underneath. The boat rose first, then the stern, maybe a foot, maybe more. It felt like something wide and alive was underneath, pushing us up, testing our weight. We froze. Neither of us spoke. My eyes were locked on the black water surrounding us, scanning for bubbles or movement. Then I saw it. A shape, just below the surface, moving. Gray skin, smooth, not fish scales, more like dolphin hide, stretched out over something impossibly massive. And wide, too. Whatever it was, it spanned beneath the entire boat. "Start the engine," I whispered. "Start it now." Nate pulled the cord. Made no noise. The boat tilted more. Not enough to capsize us, but enough to feel it in your knees. The way your balance changes when the floor beneath you isn't really the floor. The water around us started swirling, slowly like a whirlpool that hadn't made up its mind yet. I leaned over the side, shining my flashlight into the depths, and I saw an eye. One massive, pale eye, the size of a dinner plate, slowly rolling upward towards the surface, cloudy and lidless, ringed with scars like an old barnacle wounds. It blinked sideways, and then the boat dropped, all at once. slammed back into the lake so hard we nearly fell out. Water rushed in over the sides. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life. Nate didn't wait. He threw it into gear and we tore across the lake, bouncing hard over the surface. Behind us, the water boiled. Something broke the surface for just a second. A rigid spine, arced like a serpent's back, trailing a long, pale form that vanished beneath. We didn't speak. Back on the shore, we pulled the boat up and left it there, half on land. We sat in silence on the cabin porch, hands shaking. I noticed Nate was pale, like gray pale, like he'd seen something worse than me. You saw it too, I finally said. He nodded. What was that? I don't know, he said, but my granddad used to say this lake was cursed, that nothing good ever came out of it. That night, the water didn't sleep. We could hear it lapping against the shore, slow and heavy like something was brushing the banks, circling the cabin. I could hear thuds every few minutes, like something nudging the dock from underneath. We didn't sleep, just waited for morning, praying we'd make it. We left at dawn, didn't bother locking the cabin. We drove in silence until we hit paved road. Neither of us said a word for about what we saw, not for weeks. Then one day, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photo, an aerial shot of Birch Hollow Lake, but it wasn't round anymore. It was shaped like an eye, and scratched into the back of the photo in a shaky, wet-smudged hand. It was never a lake. Fishing was my sanctuary. For years, I'd slip away from the chaos of everyday life and find peace on the water, alone with my thoughts. The slow rhythm of casting and reeling, and the endless sky. The lake near my hometown was my favorite spot. A hidden gem surrounded by thick forest, far from roads or noise. I never expected it to turn into something I never forget. Sometimes, that still haunts me. It started last fall, early October. The kind of chill in the air that nips at your skin but doesn't quite freeze it. I packed my gear the night before. Rods, tackle box, some sandwiches, a thermos of coffee. The aluminum boat, battered but reliable, was already at the dock waiting. I left just before dawn. The lake was wrapped in mist, the surface so still it looked like glass, not a ripple. The only sounds were the occasional call of a distant loon and the soft slap of my boots on the wooden dock. I pushed off quietly, letting the boat glide into the open water. I drifted to my usual spot, near a submerged tangle of trees, perfect cover for bass and pike, and dropped my line. For hours I caught nothing, just the gentle bobbing of the boat and the occasional splash from unseen fish. The sun climbed higher, burning off the fog, turning the lake into a shimmering mirror. I was about to reel in for a break when the line jerked hard. My heart leapt. This wasn't a nibble or a small fish. It was heavy and deliberate, the kind of pull you don't get from anything less than a big catch. I grabbed the rod, fingers tightening around the cork handle. The fight was immediate, a strong, steady drag pulling the line taut. I hurried back, trying to keep my balance in the rocking boat. The battle lasted longer than any fish I'd caught before. It pulled left, then right, then down deep, and every time I fought to reel it back up. My arms burned, sweat trickled down my neck. The world narrowed to me, the rod and the unseen monster beneath the water. Then I saw it. The water broke with a splash, a body massive and wet rising slowly. At first I thought it was a man who'd fallen in or someone stranded, but then I saw the skin. It wasn't human. Smooth and slick, covered in patches of green-gray scales, glinting like fish skin in the sunlight. The broad chest and the arms rippled with muscles that looked part man, part aquatic beast. Fingers were long and webbed, tipped with claws sharp enough to shred the boat's side. Its head was tilted slightly, and I caught sight of gills opening and closing along its neck, like slits breathing in rhythm. Its face was the worst part, human-shaped but distorted, with black pupilless eyes that reflected the sky like dark pools. I froze. The line slipped from my hands and fell slack. The creature stared at me with something I couldn't name. Curiosity, recognition, loneliness. Then it let out a low, guttural sound. Not quite a growl, not quite speech. My throat tightened. I wanted to speak, to say something, but words failed me. Slowly, it lifted further from the water, revealing its full height, nearly 7 feet tall, towering and grotesque. Its wet hair clung to its scalp, dark and slick. Then it did something I never expected. It reached out and touched the boat's side with a cold, slimy hand, gripping it gently but firmly. For a moment, I saw a flicker of sadness in its eyes. Then, with a sudden shove, it forced the boat to tip sharply. I scrambled to keep my balance. The creature didn't attack. It just looked at me. And then it slipped beneath the water with a splash that echoed through the lake like a scream. I sat there trembling, the silence heavier than before. My mind raced with questions. Who or what was it? Where did it come from? Why had it let me live? Back on shore, I barely spoke as I pulled the boat out of the water. Nate, my fishing buddy, was waiting at the dock. "You look like you saw a ghost," he said, squinting. I didn't want to tell him what I'd seen. Who would believe me anyway? I didn't even believe myself. That night, I barely slept. I kept seeing those black eyes in the darkness behind my eyelids. I kept hearing that guttural sound, like a whisper just beyond hearing. Days passed. I avoided the lake, but the memory haunted me. Weeks later, though, I went back. The lake looked the same, still quiet. I launched the boat and drifted out again, but this time the water felt different, thicker and heavier. The air grew colder. I could feel eyes on me, just beneath the surface. I cast my line with my hand shaking, and then the water erupted. The creature rose again. This time it didn't hide. It stared at me with those endless black eyes, reaching out as if begging, and then I understood. It wasn't a monster. It was trapped. Like me. Like us. I left that lake, knowing I could never go back. Because some catches aren't meant to be pulled in. Some secrets are much better just left underwater. Fishing was always my way out. A way to find silence when the world got too loud. Blackwater Lake, nestled deep in the forest far from civilization, had become my sanctuary. It was the kind of place that demanded respect. The water was dark and cold, shadowed by towering pines, and every trip there felt like stepping into another world. I'd been coming here for years, always with Duke, my German shepherd. He was more than a pet. He was my constant companion, my protector, and somehow he seemed to understand the lake better than I did. That morning the air was cool and crisp, the kind of clean cold that makes your lungs fill with fire. The sky was still dark with dawn's early shadows when I loaded the boat. Duke sat quietly in the back, tail wagging softly as I packed the last of my gear. The dock was slick with dew, and the wood groaned under my boots as I pushed the boat off into the still, glassy water. We slipped into the lake's silence, the only sounds of the gentle splash of oars and Duke's quiet breathing. The water was perfect, smooth and unbroken, except for the occasional ripple from fish below. I dropped the line near a sunken cluster of trees, a favorite haunt for bass, and settled in. Hours passed peacefully. Duke lay at the front of the boat, ears perked, eyes watching the forest line. I thought about how lucky I was to have this little escape, this perfect solitude. But then, without warning, the wind shifted. A low rustle grew into a steady howl, and the sky dimmed. Dark clouds churned on the horizon, rolling like waves of smoke. Duke stiffened, rising to his feet, tail lowered. I glanced up, heart sinking. "This can't be good," I muttered. The first rumble of thunder echoed over the lake, distant but growing closer. I packed up my rods, trying to stay calm, but the wind was already picking up, pushing the boat with increasing force. Duke paced the bow, restless, his nails scraping the boat's floor. The storm hit fast. Lightning splashed across the sky, illuminating the swirling gray clouds like fire. Rain poured down, cold and fierce, hammering the metal roof of the boat. The wind screamed, tearing at my jacket and whipping the water into angry waves. I fought the tiller, trying to steer back to shore, but the motor sputtered and died. We were adrift. The waves grew monstrous, towering and merciless. Each crash threatened to flip the boat. Duke barked, loud and urgent, his eyes wild with fear and determination. I grabbed him, holding tight, but he wiggled free and leapt overboard. "No, Duke, no!" I yelled, panic choking me. But Duke was gone. All I could see were splashes as he paddled furiously against the current. The boat lurched violently, tossing me like a rag doll. Lightning lit the lake, and I saw dark shapes moving beneath the surface, enormous, slow, and unnatural. The water around me boiled as if alive. Then came a massive wave, taller than anything I'd seen, barreling toward me like a wall of death. I closed my eyes, bracing for impact, but before the wave struck, Duke appeared, swimming with incredible strength toward a rocky outcrop just visible through the rain and mist. He barked and circled, urging me to follow. Summoning every ounce of strength, I fought the boat toward him. The wave crashed behind me as I reached the outcrop. The water calmed. Duke scrambled aboard, shaking off water, eyes blazing with fierce intelligence. We huddled there, soaked and trembling, while the storm raged around us. Hours later, the sky began to clear. Stars blinked through the clouds. I looked at Duke, grateful beyond words. But something was different. The lake had changed. There was a dark weight beneath the surface, something watching. Over the next days, I noticed strange things. The water seemed colder and darker. At night, distant sounds echoed over the lake, low growls, splashes, and whispers I couldn't place. Duke refused to go near the shore alone, growling at empty patches of forest. I realized that whatever had stirred that storm wasn't just weather. It was something old, something angry, something beneath Blackwater Lake that had been disturbed. And I knew one thing with terrifying certainty. Duke saved me from the storm, but neither of us was safe from what lived in the depths. After that night, on the rocky outcrop, I couldn't shake the feeling that Blackwater Lake was no longer just a place of peace. It had become something else, a dark, restless thing that watched me with cold, empty eyes. I tried to convince myself the strange sounds were just wildlife, or the wind playing tricks, but Duke knew better. He stayed close, ears perked and growling low whenever we neared the water's edge. One evening, a few days after the storm, I took Duke out again, just to check the boat and see if it was safe to fish. The sun was setting, bleeding orange and purple into the sky. As we floated near the center of the lake, the water suddenly turned oily black around us, as if something huge was stirring beneath. Duke stiffened, growling fiercely, and then I saw it. A shape, vast and slow-moving, just below the surface. It wasn't a fish. It was something else. The water rippled violently. A pair of glowing eyes appeared, watching us with ancient hunger. The creature's outline was enormous, vaguely humanoid but twisted, scales shimmering like wet stone, claws scraping the hull. My heart hammered in my chest. I reached for Duke, but he was already barking, fierce and desperate. Suddenly, the creature lunged upward, smashing the water near the boat with a force that rocked us hard. I grabbed the oars, rowing frantically to escape. Duke leapt to the bow, barking and growling, his hackles raised. We were racing against something prehistoric and merciless. Over the next few weeks, the attacks grew. Not direct assaults, but warnings. Waves that knocked me off balance. Strange shadows that darted beneath the boat. Eerie whispers carried on in the wind. I couldn't fish anymore, not without feeling eyes on me, not without Duke growling at invisible threats. One night, I woke up to the sound of splashing outside my cabin near the lake. Duke was gone. Panic seized me as I ran outside into the moonlight. Near the water's edge, Duke stood rigid, staring into the dark water. And then I saw it again. Two glowing eyes watching us from beneath the surface. Duke growled low, his body tense, ready to fight. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it across the lake, catching a glimpse of the creature's grotesque form before it vanished beneath the waves. I realized then that this creature had claimed Blackwater Lake for itself, a guardian or a monster. I wasn't sure which, but one thing was certain. It wanted me gone. Duke stayed by my side every moment after that, refusing to leave me alone. Together, we had survived the storm. Together, we would face whatever darkness lurked beneath Blackwater Lake. Fishing with Mike was never just a pastime. It was a tradition, a bond forged in the waters of every river and creek we could find. From childhood through adulthood, Mike and I chased trout and bass, escaped the chaos of life, and shared silent moments beneath towering trees. That spring, though, something about the river felt different. It was early April, the snow melting in the high mountains, flooding the rivers with ice-cold water that surged and roared. The usual placid creek near our town was transformed into a wild beast, brown with sediment swollen beyond its banks, rushing with a fiercity I hadn't seen before. Mike and I had been planning this trip for weeks. The river was supposed to be high, sure, but that meant the fish would be more active. We packed lightly, but carefully. Rods, tackle boxes, warm clothes, and food for the day. Duke, my old German shepherd, would have come, but the trail was too narrow for his size. The morning was cold and sharp. We met early at the edge of town, our trucks loaded, excitement mixed with a little apprehension. Mike grinned at me as we drove out of town, the sky a patchwork of gray and blue. "Ready to catch the big one?" he asked. "I'm just ready to get out of the house," I replied, smiling. We arrived at the trailhead near the riverbank mid-morning. The river was already loud, a constant thunder in the background that filled the forest. We hiked down the narrow path, the earth soft and damp beneath our boots, the air thick with the smell of pine and wet leaves. The trees leaned toward the river, their branches heavy with fresh buds. When we reached our usual fishing spot, a bend where the river slowed behind a cluster of fallen trees, I felt a pang of unease. The water was turbulent, churning violently, foam gathering at the edges. Mike shrugged off my concerns. "Come on, it's just water," he said, stepping carefully onto the slick rocks. I watched as he moved with practiced ease, and then the current grabbed him like a living thing. His footing slipped. "Mike!" I shouted. He fought the water's pull, arms thrashing, eyes wide with terror. I reached out, but he was gone beneath the surface. Panic surged through me as I dove in after him. The water was freezing. It slammed me against rocks, pushed me under, spun me around. I fought to the shore, coughing and shivering, but Mike was gone. I spent days searching, calling his name into the wild woods, scanning the riverbanks, no sign. The local authorities helped, but after 2 weeks the official search was called off and Mike was lost. The months that followed were a haze of grief and disbelief. I couldn't accept that my friend was gone. Then, one late autumn evening, I saw him. The mist clung to the river like a living thing, thick and cold. As I walked the familiar path alone, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw Mike, but not the Mike I remembered. His skin was pale and clammy like wax. His eyes were dull and glassy. He moved slowly, stiffly. When he spoke, his voice was hollow. "I'm back," he whispered. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't feel the wrongness in the air. Mike avoided sunlight, stopped eating, and spent hours staring into the river's dark water. At night, I heard him humming a strange, haunting tune. Days later, I followed him to the riverbank. The water glowed faintly, an unnatural light pulsing beneath the surface. Mike knelt, dipped his hands in the cold water, and whispered words I couldn't understand. Suddenly, the river surged and pulled him under again. I screamed and lunged, but he was gone. Mike returned hours later, but he was even worse. His eyes held something ancient, something waiting beneath the surface. Over time, his behavior grew more erratic. He'd disappear for days, and when he'd come back, his skin was colder, and his eyes were empty. Sometimes I caught him staring at me with a strange hunger. I realized the river hadn't just taken Mike, it had marked him, and I feared it would come for me next. The river had a secret, a darkness older than any of us, and it wasn't done claiming souls. I don't know how much longer I can fight it. And after Mike's return that cold autumn night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else had come back with him, something colder and hungry. Days blended into nights as Mike's strange behavior deepened. He no longer spoke like the man I knew. Instead, his words were fragmented, whispered in a language I couldn't place, syllables curling like smoke from his lips. One evening as dusk settled over the river, I sat on the porch of my cabin, watching Mike through the trees. He was standing on the bank, his face pale in the moonlight, eyes fixed on the dark water. "Mike!" I called softly. He didn't turn. His lips moved, repeating the same strange chant. Suddenly, the river stirred. The water shimmered unnaturally, glowing faint green beneath the surface. A low hum rose from the depths, vibrating in my bones. The forest around me grew deathly silent. I stood, heart pounding. Duke, who had come with me, growled deeply, hackles raised. Before I could move, a hand or something like that broke the surface of the water. It was long, webbed, scales glinting like wet obsidian. The water erupted, and from the depths rose a figure, half man, half something else. Its eyes glowed cold and empty. It reached toward Mike, who didn't resist. The creature's breast smelled of brine and decay. I shouted, running toward the riverbank. Mike turned slowly, his eyes now completely black. He smiled a terrifying, unnatural grin. "Join us," he whispered, voice layered with something unhuman. Suddenly, the creature and Mike slipped beneath the surface together. The river calmed instantly, as if nothing had happened. From that night on, the river seemed alive with a malevolent presence. Fish vanished, animals avoided the banks, and the air tasted of salt and rot. I tried to warn others, but they only laughed. An old river legend, they said. But I knew better. The river was a gateway, and Mike was its first, but not last, victim. There were 4 of us. Me, Derek, Rich, and Leo. We were all in our late 20s, longtime friends who'd grown up together and never quite let go of the things we loved as kids. Fishing trips, sleeping in tents, telling stories that were a little too dark to be funny. We picked up out a lake none of us had ever been to before, Granite Hollow, up near the border, just past a collapsed fire road and thick woods that didn't look like they'd seen a chainsaw in years. It had no campsites, no ranger station, just water and trees, the kind of place that didn't want to be found. That's probably why we went. We launched the boat early on a Friday morning. It was Rich's dad's old flat-bottom aluminum skiff, enough for the 4 of us and a small outboard motor that coughed smoke every time it started. The lake was glassy, black in the early light, ringed with tall trees that looked like they'd been standing since before people knew what roads were. We fished near a rocky island in the center of the lake. It was dead quiet, no birds, no bugs, not even wind. It felt like the kind of silence that has weight. That's when we first saw him. A small wooden skiff, maybe 100 yards away, drifting out of the morning mist. Standing in it was a man, old, hunched, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, low so we couldn't see his face. He wasn't rowing, just standing perfectly still, watching us. No one said anything at first. Derek gave a weird half laugh and said, "It's probably just some old hermit." But I watched him for a long time. The way he didn't move, didn't even sway with the waves, like he and the boat were one solid piece. We fished for another hour trying to ignore him, but he didn't leave. Wherever we moved, he stayed within sight, never closer, never farther, just watching. Eventually we gave up on fishing. Something about the air felt wrong, heavy. We motored back toward the northern shoreline where we'd camped. As we approached the trees, Rich looked back. "Guys," he said, his voice tight, "he's following us." I turned. The old man's boat was now behind us, maybe 60 yards back, pointed directly at our skiff. But something was very off. There were no oars in his hand, no motor on the boat, and yet he was gliding steadily through the water. We beached the boat and got the fire going, trying to shake it off. We all agreed it was weird, but it wasn't threatening, just unsettling. That night we drank by the fire and made jokes to cover the unease. Leo swore he saw the man's boat anchored just offshore, but when we looked, the water was empty. Still, none of us slept well. The next morning, the lake had changed. Waves, big ones, bigger than a lake that size should have had, especially without wind. And worse, our boat was gone. We found drag marks in the sand, not pulled out of the water, but into it, and out on the lake. That skiff, far away, motionless. But the old man, he was standing in it again. He raised one hand. The water churned. He raised the other. A wall of water began to form behind him, taller than the trees, trembling like it was alive. We ran. We scrambled up the rocks as the first giant wave struck the shore, spraying water 20 feet inland. Derek screamed. Leo grabbed my arm. Rich shouted something I couldn't hear over the crashing water. Then the boat appeared again. Ours. Floating, rocking gently just offshore, like bait. I think he wants us to leave, Derek muttered. Rich didn't wait. He sprinted for the boat, diving into the freezing water. I followed, heart hammering, the others close behind. We reached it, climbed in, soaking and breathless. The skiff was farther now, retreating, but the waves got worse. We started the motor. Nothing. Tried again. Nothing. Then a splash. From behind the boat, I turned. He was there. Not his skiff. He was in the water. Only his head above the surface, pale, wrinkled, eyes wide and black like the bottom of the lake. He reached out, grabbing the back of the boat. It rocked violently. Then he opened his mouth, far wider than any human should open, and let out a low, deep moan that vibrated the water. And suddenly the boat lifted. Not from a wave, from beneath. We screamed. I grabbed the emergency paddle and slammed it towards his head. He vanished under the water. The boat dropped hard. The engine coughed once, twice, and started. We floored it. Behind us, the skiff floated again, but empty. The water calmed and the sun broke through the clouds like nothing had happened. But we didn't stop driving until we reached shore. We never found the old skiff again, or the man. But I see him, sometimes on other lakes, just for a second, a hunched shape in a small boat, waiting and watching. I've always found peace in fishing. It's one of the few things that ever calm my mind. Casting a line out onto the still water in the early morning, fog curling over the surface, birds calling from the trees. It felt like nothing could touch me out there. That's probably why I went out to Lake Des Marias that weekend, even though people around town had started whispering about strange things. Fish going missing, whole nets shredded, a dog vanishing right off a dock. Talk like that usually came with a laugh and a beer, but this time there was something quieter about it, something afraid. But I didn't believe in that kind of thing. I should have. I drove up Friday afternoon with my buddy Sean. We'd been fishing that lake since high school. The place was remote, deep in the woods, no cell service, no cabins, just a boat launch, a rickety old dock and miles of silent water, surrounded by pine and cedar. We launched the boat just before sunset. I remember the air had this strange stillness, not just quiet, but hollow. No wind, no bugs. The lake wasn't even rippling. Dead calm, Sean muttered, standing at the bow. It's like the whole place is holding its breath. I didn't say anything, but he was right. Something felt off. The trees didn't move. The birds were gone. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rain was coming, even though the sky was clear. Still, we pushed off. We drifted across the water in silence, casting near the shoreline where the rock dropped off into deeper water. We didn't catch much, just a few lazy bluegill. I figured the fish were down deep, avoiding the temperature change. Sean switched to heavier tackle and cast way out into the open water. The second his lure hit the surface, the line went tight. "Got one," he shouted, reeling hard. But then he stopped. He just froze. The line wasn't moving like a fish fight. It was dragging, pulling, steady, slow, and downward. "It's not a fish," he said, voice shaky. "Cut the line," I said. But he didn't. He held on. The rod bent hard, groaning. Sean leaned back, struggling to hold it. And then, like a switch flipped, the water exploded. A massive splash. Something long, too long, broke the surface and slammed back down. Then the line screamed, and Sean went over the edge. 1 second he was there. The next, he was gone. I lunged, grabbing the edge of his flannel shirt, but the force was incredible, like a truck pulling at him from below. My fingers slipped and he disappeared into the dark. I screamed his name and looked over the edge. Nothing. Just ripples spreading outward, dying into stillness. I fumbled with the anchor, dropped it in, then drove after him. The water was freezing, so cold, it felt electric. Visibility dropped instantly, murky green-black, but I swam downward, kicking hard, my eyes burning. I saw something ahead, a shape, Sean. His body was limp, suspended in the water, but he was still moving, being dragged deeper, slow and steady, like caught in an invisible current. I swam harder, reached for him. That's when I saw it. A tail, thick, powerful, covered in rigid, dark gray scales. It wasn't a fish, not entirely. It had a tail, yes, but also arms, long, muscular arms ending in claws that gripped Sean's ankle. The thing turned and I saw its face. Yes, it had a face. Wide mouths full of broken human-like teeth, a slitted nose and eyes, pale, clouded eyes like blind pearls. They locked on me with a kind of awareness I'll never forget, and it dragged him through an opening in the lake bed, a crack in the stone I never knew existed, an underwater cave. I followed, I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could still save him. Maybe I wasn't thinking at all. I swam through the opening, down a narrow, jagged tunnel that felt far too tight. My lungs burned, my heartbeat thumped in my ears like a war drum. The tunnel opened into a chamber, pitch black, save for faint greenish-blue light glowing from patches of lichen on the walls, and there at the bottom of the chamber lay Sean, unmoving, but the creature was nowhere in sight. I swam down, grabbed him, turned him over, and his eyes were wide open, not blinking, just staring. And his mouth moved. Bubbles escaped his lips, but no sound. I tried to pull him up, but something was wrong. His body was stuck, like rooted into the ground. His skin felt wrong, slick and rubbery, like the thing that took him. Then something moved behind me. I turned to see a dozen of them, dark shapes slithering along the cave walls, just barely visible in the dim light, all with the same pale eyes, all with human-like faces, twisted into something that had never belonged in sunlight. They were watching me, waiting. I let go and swam away. I don't know how I made it out, just that eventually my lungs gave out and I burst to the surface, gasping, clawing at the air. The boat was still there, rocking gently, and Sean never came back. I reported it, of course, told the sheriff he fell in and didn't surface. They searched for days, dragged the lake and found nothing. But I know where he is. He's still down there in that cave. And some nights, when I sleep too close to running water, I hear his voice in my dreams. It pulled me under, but I'm still here. Months passed. I don't talk to anyone about what I really saw. What could I say? I stopped fishing, stopped sleeping, started locking every door and avoiding even puddles on the street. But then, the dreams changed. They got sharper, louder, the voice more urgent, more familiar, and sometimes I wouldn't be dreaming at all. I'd be walking down the hall of my apartment, and I'd hear wet footsteps behind me. I'd turn to see nothing. Or I'd wake up with a taste of algae in my mouth, my sheets soaked like I'd been lying at the bottom of a lake. Then one night, I had a dream that wasn't a dream. I was underwater again, but this time I wasn't alone. Sean was there, but he was different now. His skin was pale, almost translucent, webbed lines along his jaw, eyes still glassy, but not empty. He spoke, and this time I could hear him. I can't leave, he said, but you can come back. I don't know why I returned to the lake. Maybe guilt, maybe something more. I packed a bag, drove out to the lake just before dusk. The water was even darker than I remembered. The surface didn't move. It looked like a hole in the world. I stood on the shore for a long time, then wandered in. One step, then another. The water was freezing. I dove in and the lake welcomed me. If you're reading this, if someone finds this, don't go to Lake des Marius. There's something down there, something old, something that was never meant to be disturbed. And if you hear someone calling your name from the water, don't answer, because it isn't them anymore, and soon, it won't be you either. I fish alone, mostly. Always have. I like the silence, the kind that hangs low over the water before dawn, when the world feels like it's still deciding whether or not to wake up. That's what draws me in. Not the fish, not the challenge, the quiet, the calm, the nothingness. I don't go to the big lakes or tourist spots. I stay off the map. The lake I visited that morning was one I'd only heard about in fragments, a place called Crater Ridge Reservoir, way up in the hills where the road narrows to dirt and the trees start to lean in on you like they're listening. It wasn't on any of the state's official fishing guides, no signage, just a faint 2-track path leading down to a rotted-out launch dock. I'd found it on an old hunting forum, buried in a thread titled, Where Not to Go. That should have stopped me, but I was curious, and I was tired of everywhere else. The lake itself was hauntingly still, dark pine-tinged water that never seemed to ripple. The trees around it were tall and old, their trunks gray and flaking like ancient bones. The air was cold for August, not crisp, just off. No wind, no bugs, no birdsong. I pushed off in my small rowboat, just me, my tackle box, and a thermos of coffee, and rowed to the center of the lake. It wasn't big, maybe a half-mile across. The water dropped off fast, though. I tossed a line with the depth finder and lost signal before it hit bottom. Didn't think much of it at the time. I've been fishing for about 30 minutes when I first noticed something moving across the lake. Just a shimmer, then a figure, a boat drifting. At first I thought it was empty. No oars, no motor, just gliding slowly toward the center, like someone had pushed it off and forgotten. And then I saw him. A man, sitting in the middle of the boat, perfectly upright, his back toward me. He wasn't paddling, just staring over the water. I watched for a while and didn't call out. Figured he wanted to be left alone like I did. But then, he screamed. Not a startled shout, not a cry for help. A long, ragged, bone-deep scream. The kind that sounds like it's building for years. It echoed across the lake, loud and broken. It sounded like he was being torn in half. I nearly dropped my rod. Then, after a moment of silence, he screamed again. Over and over, screaming like his mind was trying to escape his body. I stood up in the boat, called out, "Hey, you okay over there?" He didn't turn, but I saw his arms rise. And then, I swear, he started ripping out his hair. Clumps of it, fistfuls, yanking it from his scalp like it was poison, like it had to come off. I watched, frozen as he kept pulling, screaming between gasps until I could see the raw skin underneath. And then he stood up in the boat, arms outstretched, still screaming. The boat didn't even rock, just sat perfectly still like it was bolted to the lake. Then he turned and looked directly at me. I don't know how to describe his face. It wasn't rage, it wasn't fear. It was worse. It was the look of someone who had seen something so far beyond comprehension they didn't know what they were anymore. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and glassy. His lips were cracked and torn, the corners stretched into something that might have been a smile or a grimace. I started paddling backward without even realizing it. My hands were shaking. The oars slapped awkwardly against the water. Then the man took a step forward and fell into the lake. Just dropped, like a puppet with the strings out. No splash or thrashing, just gone. And the boat stayed perfectly still. I waited and watched. Minutes passed, then half an hour. No bubbles, no ripples, no sign of the man. Just that boat drifting slowly, now turning in a lazy circle, like it had no memory of where it came from. Eventually, I rowed back to shore, fast. I didn't pull my line, didn't look back. I packed up in silence, shoved everything into my truck, and drove until the trees started looking familiar again. That night, I called the sheriff's office in the next county over. I told them what I saw. A man in distress disappeared into the water. The deputy paused and asked, "Crater Ridge?" I said yes. It was a long silence. Then he muttered, "We've gotten calls about that place before. Always someone different. Always the same story. Screaming. Hair gone." I asked if anyone had been found, and he said no. Just empty boats floating in the middle of the lake. It's been 2 years since that day, and I haven't gone fishing since. I still dream about that scream, the ragged, primal sound of someone unraveling in real time. Sometimes I wonder what he saw out there. What could do that to a man? What's beneath that lake watching? Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed longer and waited. Sometimes I wonder if I would have screamed and pulled out my hair too.